Okay, Liz is on. Just getting set up. I've just been watching the election results with enormous trepidation.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Colleagues, I can't see. Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to let colleagues join slowly. But in the meantime, could you put your name and your organization in the chat box? It's really lovely to see who is present and who is in the room while we wait for others to join. I'll give it a few minutes. Maybe just your name and what organization you're from.
Recording in progress. Recording in progress.
Yes. Okay, it's extraordinary watching the chat just grow in length. Great. We've got quite a full morning's discussion. So I think let's jump into this now. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this, our sixth and final, actually, topic of our 6-month webinar series together with Elifa, Labantwana, and RECEP and Data Drive 2030. We've had an extraordinary 6 months of input from a huge range of colleagues. And we're delighted today to have a discussion turn very much more into an evaluation. We're looking at, we've got Tara and Magali will be presenting later on the Yizani Sifunde evaluation. Now, Yizani Sifunde is a joint early literacy project between Book Dash, welcome Julia, I saw you there, Nal'ibali and Wordworks, and Shelley, I saw you there, and colleagues from around the country, which was implemented about 2021 to 2023 in various communities in the Eastern Cape. It was quite a multi-pronged intervention. It involved a provision of quality books, training, teaching materials, and support to ECD centres, homes, and the communities. And this webinar looks at the results of this independent evaluation and unpacks and reviews the considerable learning gains that children who were impacted by the project were seen. This was evidenced in the scores of the ELOM 4 and 5 and some of the ELOM 6 and 7 items. Now, the ELOM 6 and 7 have been renamed the ELOM R to be more linked to grade R as it should be. The study also presents some regression results and discusses outcome variables that made these ELOM gains possible, both in the ECD centres and in homes, as evidenced by a range of different qualitative data. So there's going to be a significant opportunity during the course of this webinar to ask questions on both the evaluation and the project itself. So I thought what I'm going to do, it's a joint presentation between Tara and Magali. Magali will be starting, Tara will be coming in and presenting the findings, and then Magali will be closing off. But I thought, let me give you an introduction to who the two presenters are. Magali from Blottnitz has worked in finance, in policy research, and in teaching before moving into the field of monitoring and evaluation in 2016. She currently works as a consultant to Wordworks and has a particular passion for innovative boundary-crossing projects in education, as well as for using data for the sector's collective learning. So this evaluation was commissioned by the Liberty Community Trust, as you're going to find out, and Magali oversaw the evaluation. And then Dr. Tara Polzer Ngwato is the founding director of the Social Impacts Insights Africa, based in Johannesburg, and she was the evaluator. So she has 25 years of experience in social development, research, social change facilitation, and evidence-based decision-making support, and specializes in breaking complex systems and concepts like social cohesion and national reading system ecosystems into clearly defined and measurable indicators and tracking change over time to inform adaptive strategies. So I think I'm going to hand directly straight over to you, Magali. I would like to encourage everyone, we've got a Q&A box, to pop your questions as they emerge into that Q&A box, because I know that as you go through a presentation, things will spark. Once again, there will be opportunity, and I'm going to actually ask you, you can put up your hand and I'll ask you to unmute and actually field your questions towards the end, because this is it's really a very interesting study. We're delighted to have it presented to a wider audience, actually. We've had the privilege of hearing this in various forms fairly recently, but it is a bigger audience. It is a very much, and it really is a very topical issue about literacy assessments. So over to you, Magali.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks so much, and good morning, everyone. It's quite exciting to see the room already quite full. So yes, as Liz explained, we're going to present to you some findings from the evaluation of the Yizani Sifunde project. Yeah, I think you can move to the next slide, Tara. Thank you. Just before I start, a little disclaimer on intellectual property. As Liz has explained, this evaluation was commissioned and funded by the Liberty Community Trust, which was also our funder for the project. So they hold the property rights on the results of the evaluation. They gave permission for us to share it here. The request is that if someone wants to share this further, please acknowledge Liberty Community Trust as well as Social Impact Insights Africa as the evaluator. Thank you. Can move on. And also just to say at the bottom of the slide, you'll see a QR code and a link if you wish to quickly use some time to download our summary infographic that we produced on this evaluation that would, give you something to follow on your side as well. And you'll find also some learning briefs and the full evaluation reports on that link on the Wordworks website. So what you see on this slide, just to show you, sorry, can you just go back quickly, Tara, the previous slide? There we go. Just to show you an indication of what the project was about, you see a little girl here working with Wordworks little star sequence pictures, trying to retell a story using pictures. So that gives you an impression of the work happening in the ECDs. And then the next slide, Tara, we have here, what you see here is another ECD center in the Eastern Cape. In the corner, you see some book dash books. There's little square colored books on the yellow table. And then there's a hanging library, that black thing hanging against the wall, which is a Nal'ibali hanging library filled with book dash books. So that gives you an impression of what the project was about. But I'm going to now give you a clearer description of the project briefly. So it was indeed a collaborative project between Book Dash, Wordworks, and Nal'ibali, and the focus was on language and literacy for children aged 4 to 5. And we had 2 implementing partners in the Eastern Cape. So we have some representatives of Kululeka on the call, and ITEC was the second partner. I'm not sure, I haven't seen if they are on the call today. The project was implemented in 3 cycles of 1 year each. So we moved between 2021 and 2023, we moved to 3 different cohorts of ECDs where we reached different practitioners and children, obviously. And good to have you, Noma. Welcome. I'm just seeing in the chat that our funder has joined. And in terms of the inputs of the project, we used the concept of triple cocktail because we tried to really combine resources, quality materials to go into the ECD centers, into the homes, and also for the community, as well as training and structured plans, and also support and modeling. So I won't go into the detail of that little diagram because it's quite busy, but just to say, in a nutshell, the most important was training for the ECD practitioners on the Wordworks Little Stars program, which is a classroom program for pre-grade R. And then a lot of book dash books that were provided to the ECD centers as well as to the children for them to own and to take home. So that was a very important component. And then we had Nal'ibali story sparkers. So that's young people employed by Nal'ibali who went into the ECD centers and who worked in the communities, modeling literacy activities and supporting the entire project on the ground. I hope that gives you, I know it's very quick, but I hope that gives you a sense of what the project was about. Next slide, Tara. And then to give you a sense of the reach and the scope and reach of the project, in the 3 years, we reached 126 ECD centers. That was in 2 hubs, one around Queenstown and one around East London. In total, just over 3,000 children in those classrooms in the ECD centres. And of course, we reach more children outside of the ECD centres through community reading clubs and community members, etc. So 126 practitioners were trained. And we also had training of obviously the youth, but also parent and caregivers who were joined some parent workshops, and a total of over 230,000 books, books that were distributed to children and to the ECDs and other partners. So quite a massive effort in distributing books, as well as Nal'ibali reading supplements. So I think with this, I'm going to hand over to Tara to talk about the evaluation.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Okay, so just to say that what we're presenting today is essentially what the effect of this intervention has been. And it's a combination of an independent evaluation measuring that impact and a lot of the internal monitoring that was done by the project team, and the overall monitoring and evaluation for the 3 implementing organizations was led by Magali, so she'll bring a lot of that in as well. So on the one hand, it is, yes, very much about what can we say through an independent evaluation, what's useful about that, but also extremely important, the connection between an external independent view and a very strong internal built-in learning, reflection, research, and sort of monitoring culture within the implementing organizations. So what the, and also just to say that the evaluation included 2 components. It included qualitative case studies and it included a quantitative baseline and endline assessment. And we're actually only presenting the quantitative results here. So there is a separate report with qualitative insights that are very much about the process and the sort of the nuance of what was done and why these effects come about that we're now going to show you. And there is a report about that, and I think the link to that will also be shared with the PDF. All right. So for the evaluation, you heard that there were 3 cohorts, 21, 22, 23. This evaluation very much focused on the 2023 cohort of ECD centers. There was a little bit of a check-in with 2022 cohort to see which elements were sustained as well. And so out of the, what was it, 41 participating ECDs in the 2023 cohort, we went to 22 of those, so about half. Equally spread between the 2 hubs, East London and Queenstown, so 11 ECDs each. And then we went to each of those ECDs in February and then again in October, so baseline and endline for the year. And essentially tried to maintain a cohort of learners. So it was the same learners that were assessed at baseline and endline, and we ended up with a matched cohort of 99 learners. So pretty much everything you're going to see from now on is about those 99 learners. In addition to using ELOM tools, so very much appreciation to Data Drive for those amazing standardized tools, ELOM 4 and 5. We also used 2 elements of the ELOM R, which at the time was still called ELOM 6 and 7. So we'll actually present a little bit about that as well. And we collected data at the ECD level. So we interviewed the practitioners and the center managers, the owners. We observed the infrastructure and collected basic learner statistics. Okay, so what was the impact on the children? This is really sort of the core of what we want to talk about today and show you. And really, what the evaluation was able to show was the amount of, or the level of improvement in basic pre-literacy skills amongst learners. And this was across both regions, East London and Queenstown. This was across 4 major ELOM domains. So just say we didn't use all 5 ELOM domains. We used 3 at the baseline at the end line, and then a 4th one only at the end line. So the 3 we did at both were literacy and language, but then also the sort of underlying cognitive skills, fine motor skills, executive functioning. And then at the end line, we also included the assessment domain around emergent numeracy and maths. So let me break this picture down for you. As I said, 99 learners, baseline in February, end line in October, 4 different components at the bottom there. And what we're seeing is on the left-hand side there, that is the Eastern Cape average according to the work that Data Drive has done to standardize these tools. What you're seeing there is the green is learners who are on track, so have achieved a minimum score that is to be expected for their age. And this is normed to different months of age, for those of you who don't know ELOM already. The blue is learners, children who are falling behind, and the red are those who are falling far behind. So what we see in the middle bar there is the Yizani Sifunde sample at the baseline in February. And what you see there is that the green is smaller and the red is bigger, right, than the provincial average. So basically, learners who started off the year disadvantaged in terms of learning compared to the provincial average, this is very much expected because all the Yizani Sifunde ECD centers were in extremely poor, disadvantaged communities, whereas the provincial average includes the full spectrum. So from, you know, much more well-off urban communities, so this is not a surprise at the baseline, and this is in fact an appropriate result for an intervention that's trying to target the biggest where the problem is, right, which is in poor communities. So what we see then at the end line is a massive jump. So not just a jump compared to the baseline. Thank you, Salim. Yes, indeed. I see in the chat. But also, in fact, going above the provincial average. And that is for the number of learners or the percentage of learners who are on track, which is important. But another really important result is that we've managed to pretty much have the number of learners who are far behind. So that core question of school readiness, so being able to enter grade 1 or even grade R with the basic foundations that allow you to learn. We know that that is such a structural problem throughout the education system right from the beginning, and it then, you know, continues disadvantaging people all the way through their schooling career. And so reducing the far behind is absolutely crucial, almost as much as increasing the on track. And so what we then see is that the same pattern is in place for all of the domains. So that was literacy and language, fine motor skills the same, a massive, massive increase in on track and a decrease in far behind. Executive functioning, same. And then for numeracy and maths, well, we don't have a baseline, but we certainly have no reason to expect that these children would have done particularly well in maths. But when we see that they are far above the provincial average at the base, at the end line, we assume that that also means that there's a massive improvement there from what the baseline would have been. All right, so a further question then is always, well, which learners in the distribution were most affected by this intervention. So pretty much all the learners would have been at the lower end of the provincial distribution, as we saw. But even within disadvantaged communities, of course, there's always households with better resources, children with better starting positions, and then those who really struggle. And so what we really want is interventions that are progressive, in that they help those who struggle the most, and not just that support those who are already halfway there or doing fairly well. And what we actually see was that Yizani Sifunde did that. So struggling children, so children who were in the bottom end of the distribution for Yizani Sifunde sample at baseline, on average had a larger learning jump. So maturation effect was something that we included, so that the previous slide was very much about the Thrive by 5 standardization of on track, falling behind, falling far behind. What we've then done here is used, again, standardized calculations of how many months of learning each ELOM score point represents, and how much of those points you would expect to have changed in 8 months. So natural learning, the maturation effect, right? Because what we did is from February to October, the kids get older, they learn stuff. Every child learns something. So what is it above what they would have been expected to learn? So what we see here on this slide is that that bottom 8 months, that's the maturation effect. If we discount that, if we take that out for everyone, what we're seeing is the program effect. So the intervention had this much extra learning on top of what the kids would have been expected on average in the province to have learned in 8 months. And what we're seeing there is that the blue is the average across the entire sample. So 3.8 to 6 months of additional learning. But most important, really, I mean, we were so excited when we found this, was that for the learners who started out falling far behind at baseline, they actually received almost an entire year of, or more than a year in terms of literacy and language and fine motor skills, of learning in those 8 months. If you understand what I'm saying, right? So they received 8 months of normal learning, and then almost an entire year, even more than that, than what would have been expected, which is why they were able to often then catch up and be on track by the end of this period. So a very progressive intervention. So those are the standardized tools. And I mean, just really to say again here, thank you to Data Drive and to the Thrive by 5 team for making this kind of interpretation possible. I mean, we've been doing this for a while, and until a few years ago, we just weren't able to say much that wasn't just descriptive, that wasn't just, you know, the numbers have gone up. But what does that mean in the larger national comparative framework? And now we really are able to compare to a provincial standard, to a national standard, and to have this on track, falling far behind. And it makes such a difference as evaluators. And then, I mean, just to say that these standard deviations, so these numbers of months of learning based on the sort of points, this is again, such a valuable background research that we can all build on and use to compare across interventions. Very, very valuable. Okay, so we then also included a couple of items in our learner assessment that weren't standardized. So one of those is using ELOM R, which was ELOM 6 and 7. We only used 2 items there, so productive vocabulary and book orientation. So the ELOM R standardization is, I think, about to be released, but only as an aggregate. So we don't have that for the items, understandably. So we can't show that same level of comparison. But here we can. I mean, now that you've seen the larger picture from the standardized view, we can see that in terms of productive vocabulary, there was a positive shift. Not as big, perhaps, as in some of the other areas. And again, here we can't say how much of that is maturation, etc. But nonetheless, it's positive. Book orientation and word concept, a massive positive improvement. And these reinforce what we see from ELAM 4 and 5 in terms of the literacy and language results. These are components and elements, supportive elements of literacy and language. What we also looked at is an extra question at the end of the ELAM tool, which is a judgment call made by the assessors. So the assessors are asked to rate the level of concentration that the child had during the assessment. So that's called task orientation. Is the learner able to focus on the assessment task? And what we see here is that from the baseline to the end line, the percentage of kids who could focus all the way through this evaluation task jumped massively, as you can see, almost double. And that in and of itself, that again, sort of reinforces what we saw earlier about the fine motor executive functioning results. So Yizani Sifunde it was a literacy intervention, right? But it didn't just support literacy, it supported learners' abilities to learn, which is also why we then think the numeracy effects are what they were, even though this was not a numeracy intervention. One of the things you can also see here is that some of these effects were very specific to different regions. So you can see the difference at the bottom left there between East London and Queenstown in terms of book orientation and word concept, right? In the full report, you will see some reasons why we think this might be the case, but one way or another, however difficult and low the starting point was, the trend of the intervention being able to improve outcomes is the same. All right. So my last substantive slide is this holy grail of regression analysis. So what we really love being able to do as evaluators, and of course it's the big question that maybe in many of your minds, but also just generally in researchers' minds, is like, well, why are we seeing this effect? What aspects of the interventions that we do have the biggest effect? So there's a whole range of caveats why often it's really very hard to do regression analysis. And that's why the first insight here is that this was also very hard. It's important, but it is challenging. And it's challenging to interpret because many of the things that we do in these interventions are in fact not so easy to measure and don't fit into the sort of technical back end of what it takes to do a regression analysis. It's a very specific statistical technique. So I just want to say right up front, just because we can't report a finding doesn't mean that there's no impact. But that doesn't mean that the findings we found shouldn't be reported at some level. So that's what I'm going to share with you now. What we did is we used 3 different dependent variables. So dependent variables, what you're trying to explain, change, right? So the first was an aggregate ELAM 4 and 5 endline score. So if someone had whatever, 23 in literacy and 15 in executive functioning, you add up all 4 of the domains and you get a score. What that gives you is a continuous variable, right? So you'd have learners from whatever 10 total points to, I don't know how many the total was, but it's a continuous scale, and that's ideally what you want for regressions. Then we looked at each of the separate ELAM domain endline scores. And that's because we saw that, as in previous, you saw the first graph I showed you, that there were some differences in the amount of learning gains between the scores. And in fact, literacy, the emerging literacy was one of the smaller gains, whereas cognitive functioning, fine motor, for example, were larger. And so we were trying to say, well, you know, maybe there's different parts of the intervention that have different effects on different domains. So let's look at that. Again, those are continuous variables. And then we, again, used the aggregate and said, well, is a learner on or off track? So off track is a combination of far behind, behind and far behind. And that's a dichotomous variable. So we were then looking at what variables can we measure that affect this, that try and explain this. One of the most important findings was that this task orientation variable that I showed you it came out very, very strongly in the regressions as a predictor of the aggregate ELOM score of cognitive and executive functioning and of early literacy. And what that tells us is that we see it as a direct univariate at the top there, but also as a sort of underlying variable, right? So what multivariate analysis does, for those of you who aren't statisticians, is it says this has an effect holding everything else constant. So in your univariate analysis, you don't know if task orientation is just, I don't know, a reflection of girls maturing faster or whatever it is, right? But actually what the regression analysis, the multivariate analysis shows us is that task orientation is absolutely a clear effect on these learning outcomes, independent of everything else that's moving. So that's important. Maybe it's a completely duh moment because, you know, kids who can concentrate better do better in the assessment. But it's really important that not just the technical content of the intervention, but the ability to learn is so important. The second major finding that came out was book ownership. And so here we're not talking about prior home book ownership. We know that that's from other studies, so that's already important, but about the number of books that children received through the intervention and could take home and keep. And so as those numbers increased, it was a good predictor of the aggregate, again, of the cognitive executive function and of the numeracy results, funnily enough, not of early literacy. So there we go. But what does this mean? Very importantly, there were a number of other variables that we could not include. We wanted to. Am I looking at time? Because there was lack of variation in the sample or collinearity, all these technical reasons. So we wanted to look at what's the effect of practitioner training attendance, what is the practitioner classroom practice effect, story sparker session exposure, sorry about that, and parent workshop attendance. We couldn't include those because pretty much all the practitioners attended almost all of the training. Pretty much all of the practitioners were very skilled by the end of this in storytelling in the classroom, story sparker sessions, again, you know, so not enough variation. So just because we don't have a regression result, it doesn't mean that those didn't have a very positive effect. Other independent variables that we included were age in months, region, so which of the two, again, task orientation, number of books received, we've already spoken of those. We also included learner sex, learner socioeconomic background, via the fee level of the ECD center, the learner practitioner ratio at the ECD center, and attendance rate. So whether the learner was a regular attendee. And we included those, but they were not significant. They did not significantly affect the results. And this is very, very important because what it means is that Yizani Sifunde raised learners from a disadvantaged starting point to an on-track learning achievement, which we've seen, irrespective of their home background. So irrespective of whether their parents have slightly more or slightly less money, and irrespective of gender. That's extremely important. And then secondly, it was effective even in institutional environments where you have highly variable learner practitioner ratios and varying levels of learner attendance. So those didn't actually affect the efficacy of this intervention. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Magali.
Thanks, Tara. I'm going to try to be quick because I know we're running out of time, but I want to, I saw some questions on the chat. Also, people are beginning to ask now, what happened, what caused these learning gains? So I'm trying to give you a very quick overview of the other things that we've seen, which are more qualitative, coming out of the project. And the one side is all the shifts that happened in the ECDs. We saw generally sustainably improved teaching and classroom environment in the participating ECDs. For those who've downloaded the infographic, you'll be able to look into it in more detail, but very briefly, there's been shifts in the practices of the ECD practitioners. They were more confident. Then there's been shifts in how in the levels of engagement of the children in class. The classroom themselves were more print-rich, relaxed, calm, etc. So a better learning environment. And we found that caregivers, well, the ECD practitioners told us that caregivers complained less and that they were getting more involved, asking how they could help their children, etc. Of course, within each of these groups, there is room for improvement. There are always things that were not perfect. We've identified writing, reading corners as things that we will need to work on in the future. But generally, it was good news. And what we also found when we looked at the 2022 cohort is that those practices were still sustained after the project has moved out of the of those ECDs. And then secondly, we found that the home learning environment had also transformed. There were more conducive practices and also better resources. So very quickly on the resources side, sorry, can you just go one back, Tara? Just remove the green for now. So I'm talking about now the parents or the homes that received books, because that was the core element of the project, and all of the parents of the participating children would have received those books. So huge increase in the number of books per home, but also we found that interestingly they were playing more with homemade toys than at the beginning of the year. So that was a surprising finding. And very importantly, they were reading much more often. The caregivers were reading much more often with their children, which obviously comes from having more books. And then secondly, there were some caregivers, and not all of them, but some who were able to attend the parent workshops. And for those ones, we saw an additional shifts in terms of them spending more time, more quality time with their children, having more nurturing interactions, and also getting more involved in other types of activities like storytelling and drawing. And we know that drawing is very important also for the fine motor skills and helping to prepare for the emerging writing. Thanks, Tara. You can just finish and move on to, oh yes, just to say there's also that mutual reinforcement, I think, which was important, an important learning for this project, is that the work in the ECDs and the shifts in the homes really reinforced each other to give that quite pleasing child impact. And briefly before closing, I want to say, and you would, if you've been able to log on to the Wordworks website, you would have seen that we have 3 learning briefs that are already available that can be downloaded on the from the website. There's going to be in total 5, so the series is not completely finished yet. But we encourage you to go and download those learning briefs that are already available, and watch social media, because when the next 2 come out, they will be also posted on social media. You'll be able to find them there. Yes, so that's it from me. Liz, over to you again.
Thank you, Tara and Magali. That's an extraordinary presentation. I think you've tried to translate quite complex findings and made a significant effort, especially through the infographic, through this presentation, and then through the learning briefs, to make it really accessible to quite a wide range, wide audience. So I'd seriously encourage everyone to dig into that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people to can raise their hands, but I just wanted to prioritize. There have been quite a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A that talk about replicability. And based on what would be critical for scale, that's your question, Pam, replicability in different provinces, replicability in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think based on that is what parts of the program, we can go on to the next question there. So I thought maybe if we can first deal with that, and then I'm going to ask everyone, please raise your hand, and we can go on to the next question.
Magali, I think
Magali,
that's
Tara,
you.
I'm not sure.
I saw it unmuted, so I didn't want to speak over you. Yes, so thank you for the question. We are obviously very keen to replicate and to see this work, grow and be repeated as much as possible across the country. So as in terms of the three organizations, Wordworks, Blottnitz, and Nal'ibali, that were part of this initial project, we are keen, and we are trying to at the moment to fundraise for a second iteration of the project. But obviously we're also very keen to encourage whoever else wants to try something similar. It doesn't have to be exactly the same thing, but if there's interest in replicating from other organizations in a similar way, we'd be very pleased to share what we've learned and encourage others to also try it on their side. And it is, I think, very much designed to be scalable and to be delivered at a bigger scale. I mean, a lot of the design aspects are really meant for big scales. So yeah.
I mean, maybe just to add to that, I see Dalian asked, what is the cost per child? Magali, did you guys actually continue with that cost analysis? I know it was certainly part of the plan, because I think sharing whatever you can on that would help.
Yes. I don't have it now in my head, but we did look at it. Was a relatively costly exercise at the beginning, simply because there was a lot of learning involved and a lot of it took us essentially a whole year and a half to just get the project together, and also because of the evaluation and all the effort that we did afterwards to wrap up all this project and document and so on. So it wasn't initially designed to be cheap, but we had a total budget of 27 million rand, I think, for the 3 years.
And
so
3,000.
Is it right?
That's 9,000 per kid. But I mean, I think this is the thing, is that, as you're saying, Magali, is that there's sort of startup costs for a new idea like this. But then actually, once the books exist in a language, for example, reprinting them is much cheaper than the first initial design, once there's a functioning partnership, etc. So it's certainly compared to interventions that start with catching up backlogs in literacy in foundation phase, it's much cheaper to start earlier, right? I think the other thing to say is that on the scaling side, right, and on the kind of replication side, one of the most important kind of system learning for this intervention was the partnership between 3 organizations. And so there's often this idea that, oh, we can do something like this as one organization, and that's actually extremely hard. And there was something sort of, 1 + 1 + 1 is more than 3 when you do a partnership like this. The ability of multiple organizations to come together is part of the scaling question. Then there's also the need to really learn the technical insights of places like Bookdash, but how do you actually reduce costs for books, like printed books and book development? I think that was an incredibly important element of this. And then the scaling is the same question that we have in schools across the country, which is if you have somebody like a story sparker or a teaching assistant, so a young person who is trained and employed to support your core teachers or your core ECD practitioners. That's often seen as a big cost, but in other ways, it's job creation, it's training of people who then continue into the education sector.
Thanks, Magali. Thanks, Tara. I think that answers that question. I think Jeff in the Q&A box has asked an interesting question. Jeff, do you want to ask it or should I just read it out? I'm happy to read it out because I can't see anyone. Were you able to determine which elements of the program had the biggest impact on the ELOM outcomes or the relative contributions of each element of the project? And I think that's been asked in a few different ways in various different chat parts. What components of the triple cocktail had the most impact?
Yeah. Now, let me try to respond to that. I mean, I think that's a very important question. So the slide that I showed you on the regression results was our attempt to answer that question. And we actually found that it was very difficult. So the one thing is that we definitely know that giving children books to own is a very positive and impactful thing to do. So that we were able to measure because number of books handed out is a number, right? I mean, it's a continuous variable, so you can put it into a statistical analysis, like a regression. What we weren't able to test in the same way is the teacher training and the story sparker components. So those are the other two big parts of a triple cocktail, right? But that doesn't mean that they aren't as effective as book distribution. It's just that we couldn't measure them in that same statistical manner. So we want to just be very careful that nobody goes and interprets this to say, books are most important or more important. And we think it's very important that, in fact, all three of those components function together. So you can't just go handing out a book to a practitioner or to a child and then leave it and think that this kind of effect is going to happen. It's really about the modeling to the practitioners, teaching them how to work with those reading materials and the practices around them in the classroom. And then that the practitioners and the learners have the ongoing support of the story sparkers, again, about how to work with those physical books. But Magali, maybe you have something to add to that.
No, I think...
that sounds great, Tara. I know Pam Pickens put her hand up.
Hi,
Pam,
Liz. It's Pam Picken from the Dumore Foundation. I just wondered, I haven't heard a lot of attention being given to the implementation partners, and it would seem to me that their role is critical in terms of them being rooted in the communities and involved already with those practitioners. And I would assume that for scale, that it would be an important consideration as to who's available on the ground to actually be roll the model out.
Let me take this one. Yes, Pam, you're absolutely right. And having those partnerships already in place before the project started was critical in enabling us to roll it out the way we have. So a shout out to Khululeka and ITech if they're on the call. And indeed, you know, when we look at replicating this project, we are also looking at, you know, where do we have partners that we can draw on, because without a strong presence in the regions, it wouldn't be easy at all. So I absolutely support your point.
Elizabeth, you're... Yep.
Gabby Wills, you've got a comment in the Q&A. I wondered if you'd like to repeat that.
Liz, you there?
Yes. We can hear you, Gabby. Now you're muted again.
Hello.
Great.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, so I think it probably relates to, I mean, I think you've responded quite a bit, Tara, earlier around the issue of, you know, what does including the books and the regressions as opposed to other factors. It's not necessarily that, you know, books are more important, but I think a big missing question in the context of ECD and South Africa is really finding evidence around interventions that impact on parents and parental engagements with children and how we shift that. And I think often there's a tendency to think about ECD in isolation of parents, because the thought is, well, if we can get children into centers, that we'll be able to increase their likelihoods of getting access to better opportunities for cognitive development. And then the parent is often isolated in that process, I think, and sometimes in people's thinking. What was great about this program is that it doesn't do that, and that you're thinking about parental engagements. And I just wondered, with that effect size that you're seeing on the books, whether that's not actually just picking up also the impact that was having on engagements within the household, and parents engaging with their children, having the medium of a book around which to do that.
So, I mean, just very briefly, before Magali, I think, speaks more to this, because the Story Sparkers made a massive effort of actually speaking to parents and collecting data on that, because you're right, it's such an important component and that we often don't have data on that. So the regression showing that a larger number of books has a bigger positive effect on learning outcomes. That holds everything else constant, including kids because the books were handed out at the ECD centers, right? So, and some of those would have had more or less home engagement. So I think having the books is in and of itself important. And then, yes, absolutely, I completely agree with you that, you know, I think that one of the effects that Magali spoke about is that then when you do talk to parents, there is that additional engagement around the book. But I think those might be, you know, even the books without the parental engagement seem to have some effect if there is this support at the ECD level with the training and the Story Sparkers, etc. I think one of the lessons that we would love to include in a future iteration of this is doing that really difficult work of data linking between the learner and the parent, so that home-based information and information about which parents actually come to workshops is connected to the learner, and then we can see how that affects on the learning outcomes and the assessments. And just doing that technical linking piece is hard, but it's doable. Until we do that, we can't answer your question, Gabrielle. And I think that's one of those methodological learnings that we hope everybody can help us, and you know, we can help everybody kind of figure out how to do, because it's hard. Over to you, Magali.
Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle. It's really an interesting question, and I think what's been interesting for us is we know that working with parents is always hard, and it always gets frustrating. And interestingly, during the external evaluation, at some point, the evaluators came to us and said, I think this parental work is not really working so well because, people are very frustrated. We're hearing lots of feedback that it's not really working perfectly. And so we were, taking that in, obviously, and looking for, what can we do differently? But then when we went back into the ECDs that we had touched in previous years, in 2024, we went to the old cohorts of participating ECDs and we asked them, what changed? What was the most impactful thing for you about this project? And a lot of them said, well, the relationship with parents and engagement of the parents and the fact that they really got so much more involved and started reading and so on. So it was quite interesting for us to, just work with this contradiction or this paradox that as much as it is hard work, and you tend to get a bit despondent sometimes because you feel like, we're not getting it right. And yet, even if it's not perfect, it does make a massive difference for the ECDs and for the children in the end. I also just want to quickly say, if you've been able to download the infographic, you will see in the corner of page 3 that there is a little diagram about what led the parents to read more. We've identified a nudge effect and a joy and pride effect that helped the parents to shift their behavior in terms of reading, just from receiving the books. Just alerting you to that. Have a look. That's interesting.
The final thing, I think that's really important because, in fact, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Magali.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I'm going to have to call time, both of you. It's the most fascinating presentation. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to Lifa Labantwana for hosting. And I hope this has been of value. The last 6 months, we've tried to encourage dialogue and discussion on a very wide range of topics. And this deep diving into an evaluation of a literacy intervention has been a really positive way of ending it for now. So happy November 6th to everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will be sharing the presentation, the recording, as well as all the information that you need on the various social media parts. So don't stress about that. And thank you to all 76 people for participating today. It's been extraordinary. So keep well.
Thank you. Thank you.